Pietro lectures. We are very honored that the Della Pietro families have chosen to support us and to give us the opportunity to invite wonderful, distinguished, engaging speakers to bring their knowledge and their excitement about mathematics and physics to Stony Brook. So thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Stephen and Pam, who are not here. Thank you. So as you may or may not know, Della Pietro lectures give 3 talks. One is a public talk for the general audience, which is now. The second one is also a general audience, but that's a general high school audience. So some of you may qualify for that as well. And it's a different talk, so you may be interested. And then there is also a more technical, research-oriented talk for graduate students, PhDs, recipients, and so on. And we've been lucky to have this going on for a while. Unfortunately, there was a delay due to COVID, and we're very happy to be resuming. And today, we're very honored that Ian Stewart from Warwick University can finally visit us about 4 years later than originally planned. Hopefully, going forward, we will not have such delays, and we will not have COVID #2. So, you will enjoy this talk, I'm sure, but let me say a few words. So Ian Stewart is a professor emeritus of mathematics at University of Warwick in the UK. He has done a lot of work on algebra, catastrophe theory, dynamical systems, biomathematics, information systems, and many other things. Ian has written wonderful books, textbooks, research monographs that I'm sure some of us have read, looked at, benefited from. But Ian is also extremely well known for his amazing contributions to popular or more popular writings about mathematics, which to my mind are great in that they don't assume too much and lead you on a wonderful journey to wonderful mathematics and physics. And I think many, many people in the world, many people beyond this room, many people who are not mathematicians or physicists must have been inspired by Ian's writings. Ian has also done even more popular writing by collaboration with Terry Pratchett. I will not comment on that, but you may know what this is about. Many of you may also know or may not know that for a while Ian Stewart was in charge of the Scientific American magazine mathematical section of mathematical writings, which engaged readers. This was at the prime time of Scientific American, I think, 1990s, and Ian took over after such luminaries as Martin Gardner and Hofstadter. And some of these have now been collated into books, so you don't have to buy the entire past series of Scientific Americans. You can read them all in a book and be inspired and enjoy. If you have read them and have been inspired, remember there are also younger generations. They still need to be inspired. So with that, we're very happy to welcome Ian Stewart, who will inspire us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And I'd just like to second his thanks to everybody involved.
Microphones.
Microphones? Oh, it's on and off. I wonder why. Try again. That's better. Okay. Yeah, so thanks to Sam for that introduction. Thanks to everyone involved in making this possible. And I will get on with the talk. Okay, so Shakespeare didn't quite say this, but I want to firstly give you some examples of networks. I'm not going to define them, but I just want to show you what a broad range of topics comes under that title. It's a very hot area of science at the moment. It has been for a while. There's a huge number of applications, different areas, and some very, very nice mathematics, which I'll try to show you without going into the technical details. Right. Ecologists are interested in what they call food webs, which is basically which organisms eat which. And a food web is a network. The spread of epidemics, COVID, let's be topical, that's a network. You have people, they come into contact, the disease spreads from one to another, that's an interaction between those two people. The network is a collection of all those interactions. And an epidemic network, a little bit of one looks a bit like this. And what you see here is there are some people who are sources of multiple infections, and then occasionally there will be a connection between one of those people and somewhere else. So you see these patches of infection spreading, and then they appear somewhere else and somewhere else. And the mathematics of the epidemic, trying to predict what happens to the epidemic, has to take account of this network structure. Genetics is full of networks. You can't read a biology research journal without coming across networks. So genes produce proteins which send signals to other genes which send signals to it. And so there's this whole network of signaling between the genes, which, among other things, was involved in how all of us here came into existence and have the form that we do. This is part of the yeast genome, and it shows certain genes affecting others. The internet, of course, is a network. It had better be with a name like that. And this is a little bit of the internet, and that's an even smaller bit of the internet, part of the connections in Google at some point in the past. Now, there's a lot going on about artificial intelligence at the moment, and this is based on what are called neural networks, and they have the kind of structure that is here. There are, on the left-hand side, there's a layer of input nodes, which are where information from the outside world of some form is fed into the neural network. And then there's a whole pile of layers in between, which are all interconnected. And then somewhere at the other end is an output layer. So you show a picture at one end, perhaps it's a picture of a cat, and if the neural network is working, at the other end, the output says cat. And these things are trained by adjusting the strengths of the connections between the different layers until when you put pictures of cats in, it unerringly tells you it's a cat. And if you put pictures of a dog in, it says it's a dog, and so on. So these deep neural networks, which are now very powerful, have this very simple mathematical structure, but this is a tiny one. They have millions and millions of nodes, millions and millions, if not more, of interconnections. We have something similar up here in our brains. It's a network of neurons, and it too, particularly when we were very young, in infancy, learned how to recognize things in the outside world by changing the strengths of the connections and pruning away unwanted connections. The world trade, that's a network. Nodes of the countries, trade between countries occurs in, let's say, give it monetary value. So you get very strong connections if there's a lot of money, and much weaker connections if there isn't. And economists have to come to grips with the structure of this world trade network if they're working on that level of economic theory. There are road networks. Part of the British road network is shown here, and part of what's definitely not the British road network is shown on the other side. We do have motorways, as we call them, but they're not quite that big. Railways, they form a network. The New York subway is a network. A molecule is a network. It consists of atoms joined by bonds. The solar system is a network. We don't normally think of it as that. We think of it much as this picture. But the network structure is what Isaac Newton told us. Every body affects every other body according to the law of gravity. So this is what we call an all-to-all connected network. Each planet and the sun influences every other planet and sun. the tree of life is a network. It's a network where branches diverge as different species came into being. Here's a modern version of it, the genetic version of it. So, I've shown you a whole pile of networks, and I haven't told you what they are. But you probably got the idea by now. So, mathematically a network, the old word was graph. And graph is ambiguous and it's not as sexy as network. So, we tend to talk of networks now. The graph theorists, of course, still talk about graphs. So, it's a collection of nodes or dots joined by edges or lines, and the edges might have an arrow on them giving the direction in which the interaction occurs. So if it was an epidemic network, the arrow would show you who had the infection and who they gave it to. And there may be other structure on these networks. You can put connection strengths, probabilities, dynamics at the nodes, all sorts of exciting things. So I want to show you some of the things that people have done with the mathematics of networks. And it's mostly other people's work, I should say that immediately. I have done a lot of network research with my friend Marty over there, but I'm mostly not going to talk about anything I have done. So, 1967, Stanley Milgram did an experiment which basically consisted of taking a letter with the name of his stockbroker written on it, but not the address, and dropping it in the street and seeing if it got to him. And what they found was that when it did get to him, and quite a lot did, it was through 6 or fewer intermediate steps of personal contact. So they knew he was in Boston, let's say. So somebody picked up the letter and thought, I have no idea who this person is, but he lives in Boston. I know someone in Boston. I'll give him the letter. So they passed the letter to someone in Boston. And if you keep doing this, after a while, you get to somebody who actually knows this guy and gives him the letter. And so this idea of 6 degrees of separation came up. It's not exact, but essentially everyone on the planet is connected to everybody else on the planet in 6 or 7 steps. That's the claim. Well, I was discussing this in the common room at Warwick University with a biologist friend of mine called Jack Cohen, and we were discussing this, and the head of department wandered past and he said, Jack, that's ridiculous. How many people are there between you and a Mongolian yak herder? And Jack instantly, without thought, said, 1. The person in the office next to mine is an ecologist and he does field work in Mongolia. Now, in this little story, we actually have 2 important concepts. One is that of a hub. A hub in a network is one node which is connected to an awful lot of others. Jack was a hub. He knew everybody. He knew, I won't go into details, but every time I tested this, Jack knew an awful lot of people. The other connection is, the other concept is a long-range connection, which was essentially his next-door neighbour's connection between Warwick University and Mongolia. So that person was a long-range connection. And if you put those together, you get a lot of possible routes from one person to another, and the important routes are the long-range connections and the hubs. Now, you may have come across a thing on the internet called the Oracle of Bacon. Who has? A few. Okay. 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon is another name. Yes, you can actually... So this is... the link between 2 actors is a movie that they both appeared in. The name of the game is to name a movie actor and find the way they connect to Kevin Bacon. So we can play that game. So here we have Michelle Pfeiffer, who appeared in a thing called Amazon Women on the Moon, with David Alan Grier, who appeared in The Woodsman, who appeared with Kevin Bacon. So Michelle's Bacon number is 2. Or, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, David Wenham, Lord of the Rings Return of the King, with Brad Dourif, with Kevin Bacon. 2. It's actually very hard to find someone whose Bacon number is bigger than 2. I did find one. Mathematicians, of course, have their own version of this. It's called the Erdos number. So Paul Erdos was a hub in the mathematical world. He wrote joint research papers with over 1,000 people. And so the link is co-authoring a research paper. So your Erdos number is like the Bacon number, but with mathematical papers. So what's my Erdos number? Well, thanks to my friend Marty, it's 3. Because Marty's is 2, and because he worked with Bruce Rothschild, who published with Erdos. So we know our Erdos numbers. Okay. And to sum it up, Duncan Watts and Stephen Strogatz came up with a concept which is now very famous, which they called a small world network, which kind of explains why the 6 degrees of separation works. And this illustrates lots of short-range connections, some long-range ones, and they did the actual mathematical statistics. Now, this is important because nowadays we have air travel. These are long-range links, and particularly for epidemiologists, and indeed for governments, the long-range links are the problem. Because if there's an outbreak of some disease in another country, it used to be confined to that country. Not anymore. It's very likely to suddenly turn up somewhere. I mean, when COVID started, one of the first places it showed up outside China was Toronto, in Canada, thanks to air travel. So the modern models of epidemiology combine some of the classical ideas about how diseases spread in relatively small, close-knit communities with the idea of these long-range connections and the network structure. And there was a piece of work recently which, I'll just give you the numbers, it says there, you can read them anyway. 56,945 groups of people, 5,552,758, say it again, 552,758 venues like a sports stadium or a restaurant, and using 5.4 billion items of data from basically from the web and from mobile phones. And then they decorated that network with a mathematical model of how epidemics transfer from people to people, and they found out things like which type of venue accounts for the largest proportion of infections. And it is in fact things like sports stadiums and restaurants, as my wife and I found out when we caught it in a restaurant. Okay, what else can you do with networks? Well, you can do some surprising things, and I want to talk to you about a few examples where the mathematicians here would probably believe that these things are mathematical, and the rest of us probably would think, what math actually tells us about that? So I want to start with visual illusions, and let me just do a time check. Okay. There are lots of visual illusions. They come in at least 4 kinds. I'm going to show you examples. There are ambiguous figures which you look at them and they could be 2 different things, and you're not quite sure which. There's a thing called rivalry, where you show one picture to one eye, a different picture to the other eye, and the brain flips between them, but it doesn't combine them. There are impossible figures which at first sight look entirely reasonable until you look at the fine detail. And then there's just various shapes that fool the brain. And the brain interprets them wrongly, in the sense that what we think they're showing us is not exactly what they really are showing us. The most famous one of this is the Necker cube, which goes back to the 1800s. You look at this, it's a skeleton of a cube. Okay, and you ask, which way is the cube pointing? And it might be that that is the front face of the cube, or it might be that that's the front face of the cube. And if you look at the original cube and just keep staring at it, your brain flips it between the two orientations. It's not really a cube at all, of course. It's just a flat drawing. Another one, which I'm going to come back to, is the rabbit and the duck, which in my mind is not a very good rabbit and not a very good duck, but it's a classic illusion. You can see it as a duck facing left or a rabbit facing right. Is that a cat or is it a mouse? That looks like a perfectly reasonable elephant until you look at his feet. And somehow there's something not quite right. This is lovely. This is one of the things that just doesn't look, the way we interpret it is not what it is. It's called Fraser's spiral. It sure looks like spirals. I know what this thing is, and I can't look at it and see anything except spirals coming in. Right, so let's look at one of these spirals. Trace it round. There's another one. There's another one. It's circles. It's the striping on the circles that leads the eye in. So, a lot of people who work on vision in animals or humans, these things are clues to how the visual system works. You know, one of the ways to find out how something works is you break it and see what it stops doing. So, Marty particularly did some work with various colleagues of his on rivalry. Now this is where you show one image to one eye, one image to the other eye. So on the left is a picture where a vertical grid with pink stripes is shown to one eye and a horizontal grid with green stripes is shown to the other eye. And what normally happens with this is just that the brain flips between those two pictures. It sees the pink stripes for a while and then it pays attention to the green stripes and loses the pink stripes. That's the simplest thing that can happen. And there's another experiment using a sort of jigsaw puzzle with pictures of a monkey and some blue text on a green background. And what they've done is chop it up into 6 pieces and then swap the pieces between the two images. And again, what the eye normally sees is just one of those scrambled images or the other one, and it keeps alternating between them. But sometimes it doesn't work like that. So in the rivalry experiment with the grids, what they found were there were 4 different possibilities that were reported by experimental subjects. The first 2 were the pictures actually shown to the 2 eyes. The other 2 are what they call colour misbinding. Somehow the brain is detecting the grid and the colour and then assembling them. And sometimes it assembles them wrongly. And so they get green and pink stripes horizontally or vertically, and people are seeing those alternating, but those aren't any of the pictures that the eyes were actually shown. So there's a little bit of a puzzle there. Why is that happening? And the same thing happens with monkey text. So those are the 2 images. One goes to the left eye, one goes to the right eye, and people see those 2 alternating. But sometimes they see those 2 alternating. The brain has put the monkey together, it's put the text together. I say monkey, I think it's actually an ape, but it's always called a monkey. Yeah, so what's going on in the visual system when instead of seeing the images that you're given, the brain has somehow assembled new images out of them. Okay, so the idea is to propose some sort of model and see if it works. And Hugh Wilson came up with a basic idea for some sort of high-level idea of how the brain might be doing this. And his idea was you start with little units which you think of an attribute of the image. It might be the colour, it might be the direction of the stripe, and there are several possibilities. So let's think colour for a minute. Maybe the colour's red or green or blue. So you have a little column of nodes, and in between them are connections which, if one of them is detected, it switches off the others. These are inhibitory connections, they call them. And this gives you a winner-takes-all network. If one of these units is activated by the image, the other units will not be activated. So this is a way that the brain avoids being confused. It looks at it, okay, it's red. Right, once we've said it's red, green and blue are kind of switched off. But on another occasion, you might look at it and say, no, it's blue. And this might be the same image. It's some attribute of the image. Now, images have more than one attribute. Our coloured stripes had a direction and a colour. So you'd need at least two columns, one for the directions, one for the colour. So you build yourself a whole series of these columns, one for each of the interesting attributes you want to do. Well, this can recognise some random collection of those attributes. Now you train this network by telling it that certain collections go together to make a sensible image. In the abstract, all you do is pick one node in each column, one value for that attribute, one level, and then say, if any of those are seen, you are more likely to detect the others. So you put in what are called excitatory connections. If we see part of one pattern, we expect to see the rest of that pattern. And then you put those two together and see what happens. So let's do it with rabbit and duck. Well, there are at least two attributes we can think about. The pointy bit on the left and the sort of rounded bit on the right. And on the left, the two levels, it's either ears or beak. And on the right, it's either facing to the right or facing to the left. And so we build our two columns. The round ones have ears and beak with an inhibitory connection between them. We only ever think we're seeing one of them. And the one on the right has a head facing one way or the other. And again, you don't get both, so there's inhibitory connection. But now, if the one on the left is ears, we know that the head can't be facing left. Because if it did, it would have its ears on its nose. Yeah? And if it's the beak, it can't be the head facing right, because heads don't have beaks on the back. So you put excitatory connections, the black arrows. If it's ears, you expect to see the head facing right. If it's beak, you expect to see the head facing left. And for the hell of it, put in a couple of inhibitory connections to absolutely reinforce that. And now you've got yourself a network. And you can ask, how does that network behave when you put some dynamics into those four nodes to mimic nerve cells or collections of nerve cells which are switching on or switching off. And you get pictures like this. The graphs are showing the activity level, and the different colours are whether it's activity that's giving you ears or beak. And what we see is it alternates. It goes ears, then beak, then ears, then beak. So the perception of the ear bit is flipping between ears and beak. Similarly, the perception of the head is flipping between left and right. The brain is just exploring the options. But then these interconnections between them actually align these things so that when the brain switches to ears, the bit that's detecting with head direction switches to the right because it knows that's what goes with ears. There's actually a slight time delay between them. So this network model actually just produces the standard effect of the visual illusion switching between the two, but it explains why the two pieces kind of go together in two consistent ways. Monkey text is similar, but we have to do a more elaborate network. Well, not more elaborate, but we have to set it up in a more elaborate way. So the jigsaw puzzle has 3 blue pieces, 3 white pieces. These are the regions in the pictures on the left of that. And the network looks like this. So the first column is what do we see in the white bit? We either see monkey everywhere in the white bit, or we see text everywhere in the white bit. The right-hand column is what do we see in the blue bit? We either see monkey or we see text. Right. But if you see monkey in the white bit, the image that you're trained on will have text in the blue bit. So there's a connecting arrow between those, which is an excitatory arrow. It strengthens that connection. Similarly, if you see monkey in the blue bit, then you would expect to see text in the white bit. What you would not expect to see is both monkey and text in the white bit, because that's the same part of the picture. You're not going to see both at the same time. Okay, so putting it together, there are actually 4 patterns with which such a network can oscillate, like the rabbit duck pictures. And these are the 4 ways they go, and I'll explain this a little bit. If I put a red ring around something, it means they are all oscillating together at the same time. If I put a blue ring, it means they're all oscillating together at the same time. But the difference between red and blue is when the red one is up, the blue one is down. When the red one's down, blue one's up. So they're doing that. Okay? So we have 4 different ways of fitting them together. This is where the math comes in, and I'm not going to prove it to you. But 2 of these don't make any sense in terms of visual images. Namely, that one. If it was that one, then you are seeing both monkey and text everywhere. So that's no good. And this one also doesn't make sense because you're seeing monkey and text in the same part of the picture simultaneously. The brain doesn't do that. That leaves the other 2. Okay, now one of those is where you see monkey and text, and then it alternates to monkey and text in the other position. And the other one is where the monkey and text come together in a different way. And if you figure out what those correspond to, it is actually these 4 images. So the second and third one are the ones we trained it on, and the first and fourth are the ones that the brain decided were equally possible. And that's because mathematically that is a possible oscillation of that network. So you can see rivalry between those 2 complete images, even though the brain never saw those complete images in either eye. And the network mimics that. Okay. Good. Next I want to talk to you about something that actually Marty and I this is how we got into this area. Animal movement, animal gaits. So a gait is a pattern of footfalls. And I'm going to train you to recognise some of these gaits. The images are from the very famous Edward Muybridge. It was also originally called Muggeridge, but he decided to get posh and call himself Muybridge. And he invented a camera that took photos at very short time intervals, so he could take pictures of moving animals and people. And what's happened is somebody has strung these pictures together to make little movies, which is very nice. So we have an elephant, which is walking, and a pig, which is trotting, which is I think, appropriate. Pigs have trotters. Horse is cantering, and the deer there, well, let's see what it's doing. So here's a picture of Muybridge. So here's the elephant. Okay, and if you look at the way the legs are moving, there's a sequence in which they hit the ground. Left rear, left front, right rear, right front. And if you look at the timings, it's almost perfect rhythm when the elephant's just sauntering along. So left rear, left front, right rear, right front, over and over and over again. So that's the walk. And if another four-legged animal walks, it does the same pattern. Here's the pig. It's a sow. She's trotting. In the trot, pairs of legs move together, but it's diagonally opposite pairs that move together, and they alternate. That is a canter. That's a complicated gait. The right rear and the left front move together, and then the right front and the other one move. And this is a gallop. Left rear, and then a slight delay in the right rear. So it's left, right, then right, left, left, right. That's right. This is a so-called transverse gallop. Left, right, left, right. Cheetahs gallop as well, but they do a rotary gallop, which is left, right, right, left. Okay. So we've got all these patterns. Oh, and here's another one. Camel. Rackle pace. Moves both left legs together and then both right legs together, which I've always found surprising. You think it will fall over. Giraffes do it as well, and that really is surprising. Okay, so can we mathematically understand what might be producing this? Well, the first thing we do is try to convert the whole thing into a picture that shows the relative timings. So these are called the phases of the motion. So what I've done, I have this very elegant animal. It's viewed from above, by the way. It's not like this. It's looking down. And so the walk, at time 0, the left rear leg hits the ground. Time a quarter, the one in front hits the ground. Time a half, it switches to the other side. Time 3/4, and back again. You can see how this goes. And then you can figure out the trot. 0, a half. 0, a half. So we can draw all these pictures. So there's another one called the bound, which dogs often do. Rear legs, front legs, rear legs, front legs. There's the pace, that was the camel, and I claim the giraffe. And then the two gallops, which have some funny numbers like 0.6. And the canter and the pronk. What's a pronk? That's a pronk. The whole thing goes up and down simultaneously. So this is actually mathematically the simplest gait because all the legs are synchronized with each other. Okay, well, I'm not going to take you through the reasoning, but we came to the conclusion that the simplest mathematical network of nerve cells sending signals to the legs to make them move, to get the timing right, is a thing called a central pattern generator. You would think with 4 legs you might have 4 units, one for each leg. But for subtle mathematical reasons, you need 2 units per leg. And it looks like this. You need 2 units biologically, one to move the muscles that make it do that, the other to move the muscles make it go the other way. Muscles contract, they don't push. So if you're going to move it 2 sides, it's 2 different muscle groups. So the nodes correspond in a sense to these muscle groups. And what you do is you take 2 sets of them, you hook them together in a ring, and then you cross-connect left-right to get left-right symmetry. And by a very nice piece of mathematics, the patterns, the rhythmic patterns for this sort of network give you all of the things like the pronk, the pace, the bound, the walk. and with a little more persuasion, they give you the complicated ones like canters and gallops. So we wrote a paper suggesting that this is the simplest underlying architecture of units in, it's actually probably the spinal cord of the animal, which generates the basic rhythms. Okay. And finally, the abstract of this talk promised a discussion of evolution, so I want to talk about origin of species. So species occur when a single species, these happen to be some sort of pig-like creature, decides to split into two species. It takes a while. Okay, and we all know this idea goes back to Charles Darwin. And an interesting example of this speciation process occurs with what are now called Darwin's finches. Now, those of you who know about Darwin know he went around South America, he went to Galapagos, which is where these finches live. He collected lots and lots of specimens, he took them home, and he didn't think the finches were terribly interesting. In fact, he gave them away to a friend of his who was a bird expert. And then when he was writing The Origin of Species, at some point he had to borrow them back again to take another look. There are 13, maybe 14 species of Darwin's finch. They all evolved from the same single ancestral species about 5 million years ago, when presumably a bunch of birds were blown to the Galapagos from the mainland in a storm. And then they spread across the various islands of the Galapagos. And on each island there are different food sources, different kinds of plants, whatever. And eventually they split into these 13 or 14 species. And Darwin has a diagram of this splitting. And there are some biologists who have been studying these birds for a long, long time. And what they've noticed is you can actually track the evolution of the bird, the changes in the form of the bird, by measuring, let's say, beak size. If you could forecast the weather accurately, you could predict the evolution of the beak size. They can't do that, but what this little graph shows is how, for one species, the size of beak changes, and it changes in a dry year. In a dry year, the beaks get thicker. Why are the beaks getting thicker? Well, in a dry year, you have to have stronger beaks to crack the seeds. So the birds actually, they're not evolving a new species, but each successive generation of birds is being selected to have the beak size that will work with the prevailing weather conditions and the seed supply and everything else that's available. So this is a tiny bit of evolution in action, observable and predictable, except you can't forecast the weather. Okay. Now, there are two main types of speciation event, two different ways in which new species are believed to occur. One is, technically it's called allopatric, which just means other place. If something happens to take a population of identical organisms and separate them so they can't interbreed, and then you wait long enough, they evolve independently in the two places. They evolve to suit the conditions in those two places, and over enough time they evolve so much that if you brought them back together they would not be able to interbreed, which is the standard definition of a species. It's not perfect, but it's a working definition. And the classic example is Central America, the Caribbean side, the Pacific side. There are lots of apparently similar creatures which are actually different species, and the idea is that at one point the seas were connected and it was all in one place. So this is very believable. It's what you see is what you get. If you want them to if you want a group of creatures that are all the same to become two groups that are different, splitting them apart and forcing them away so they can't possibly interact is a good way to do it. And there's the other one, which the biologists for a long time weren't so happy with, which is called sympatric speciation. Same place. There's no barrier. The species split for some reason that even when they're all mixed together, interbreeding, they're essentially the same. And you think, well, how can they split? Because if a particular strategy is the right one to have for the prevailing conditions, shouldn't all the birds adopt the same strategy? Let's talk about birds. Yep, that's the best thing to be. If there's a lot of seeds around, you should be a seed eater. If there's a lot of insects around, you should be an insect eater. And that should apply to all of them. So why on earth should some of them decide to do one thing and some do something else? Well, the problem with that is it's a question of whether that situation is stable. And you can see this as what's called symmetry breaking. You can see this as all of the organisms are the same. That's a very symmetric situation. But in mathematics and physics, we know that sometimes the actual state of the system is not as symmetric as the rules it's obeying. And that's because the fully symmetric state becomes unstable. Slight disturbance, and instead of going back to the way it was, the disturbance grows. So what's happening, in fact, is along the following lines. If you've got a pile of birds, they're all the same, they're all eating medium-sized seeds, they're all very happy, but the population's growing and the weather changes and there aren't as many seeds anymore of that size, so the whole population is stressed. Now, some birds randomly will be able to eat slightly bigger seeds. Some birds randomly will be able to eat slightly smaller ones. Those two groups have a better survival strategy, in part because the other group is doing something different. So it becomes to the advantage of any individual to adopt one of those strategies or the other one, and it works because all individuals are doing that. So the selection pressure forces them apart. In the middle, there isn't a big enough supply of seeds for them all to do the same thing. But if they spread themselves across and exploit the resources in a different way, each individual survives better and the whole population drifts apart in that way. And so what happens in the network is all of these creatures were interbreeding, but then some of them adopt one strategy, some adopt another. And of course, to reinforce it, if you are part of the group of birds that prefers the small seeds, they're probably in some part of the island that's different from where the bigger seeds are. So the populations actually move apart geographically. And although they could interbreed, they don't. It's too much effort to go across to where the other ones are. You stay where you are. And there are some predictions about how this split happens and some simulations. Here is a graph showing 50 of these little groups of creatures, and they're splitting apart into two clusters. One of the predictions is usually two, not three or more. So it's possible to see traces of this historical process looking at two of the finches, the thing called the medium ground finch and the small ground finch. And they have Latin names. And if you look at the beak sizes on the island that is now called Isabella and was called Albemarle when Darwin was there, you find that the medium ground finch specialises on slightly smaller seeds. That's what this red histogram is showing. It's roughly 8mm beak size and a little bit either side. And if it's on the same island as the small ground finch, the beak size is about 12 for the small ground finch. They've separated. But if they're on their own on one of these islands, which is what the other two pictures show, both of them prefer 10 millimeter beaks. Technically this is called character displacement, but it's a kind of relic of the way they evolved into these two species. If you put them together, then they actually drift apart. If they're on their own, they go back to the thing in the middle. So that's another application of mathematics of networks. So all the world's a network, as William Shakespeare didn't say, and all the men and women merely nodes. Thank you.
Thank you for a beautiful talk. Questions, please.
Questions?
For the gate part, you use a central generator pattern?
Central pattern generator
Central pattern
is
generator.
the name.
So there is assumption that the same neural network does these gates for all of those animals. Why
Yes,
should it be
yes,
so?
that's right. That's an important point. It could be that there is a little network for one gate, there's a different network for another gate. If you're an engineer, you could design it that way. But the evidence is that there is some sort of universal network, and then the brain sends signals to that to kind of select one or other of its different dynamical possibilities. So depending on the strengths of the connections or other things, any one of the various patterns is possible. Signals from the brain can select one of those patterns, but it's the same network that is doing the dynamics. You can, yes. I have a friend who I haven't seen for a long time who teaches robots to walk and uses exactly this kind of, he uses a rather simpler setup, but he has a robot with 4 legs, but they're in pairs. So automatically if one goes forward, the other goes back. That was to keep it simple. And he then trained it to move on different kinds of surface, on slippery glass, on sandpaper, on other things, and then developed from there. So in fact, one of the applications of this is actually to robotics. It's an economical way of, you don't need to build the expensive parts of the equipment, you just need the one set, and then you have to tune various connections to get all the different gates. Yeah. Or whichever one you want.
The electrical grid is a network, of course, with transmission lines. I was curious about applications to find optimal, siting of transmission lines for various points on the grid.
Absolutely, yes, that's a good point. There's, I don't do this, but one of my colleagues at Warwick University is actually interested in power transmission grids, and the network structure comes in. Firstly optimizing it, also making the grid robust. What you don't want is one part of it to go down and then this propagates through the whole system. And you can use the network theory to design better grids. Yeah. There are some other similar applications. Oh, there's a lovely one actually, which is the Tokyo Railway Network. Slime mold can be persuaded to design networks for you. There's a thing called slime mold. It's individually they're amoebas, but they collect together in lump, and they're slimy and fairly mouldy. And they do amazing things, but what they do is if you put them on a surface and put food in certain locations, they will form a network of, they're like veins, a network of tubes made up of these creatures, and they funnel the food nutrients through these tubes so that all of the creatures amoebas in the group get the nutrient. And they do this in a fairly optimal way. So to get the Tokyo train network, what you do is you put food in where the main towns in the area are. The amount of food you put is roughly proportional to the population of the town, and then you put your slime mould on, and they connect themselves to the food supply in a way that will optimise the transmission of nutrients to the whole collection of slime mould amoebas, which is basically like trying to optimise the train connections for all the people in the cities. And somebody actually did this, and they did the experiments, and the slime mould managed to reproduce a pretty good approximation to the existing network, but in some ways it was slightly better. So these totally unintelligent amoebas can do this calculation. Okay, we can do it too, but there have been suggestions of building a computer using slime mould amoeba. In principle, they could do it. They can run mazes, they can do computations. It would be rather slow, and you probably need a lot of food.
More questions?
Okay,
Well, thank you very much. Well,
thank you.
So remember to tell your friends that there is also a technical talk, and there is a talk for high school students.